Hello over there and good afternoon. I'm Abdulrahim Kashur and you are watching L24 News, Russia-Ukraine special coverage. After Russia's ultimatum for the surrender of the last forces resisting Mariupol expired on April 20th, Ukraine proposed holding a special round of discussion with Russia in the besieged city of Mariupol. The chief Ukrainian negotiator and presidential assistant stated that the Ukrainian side is willing to hold negotiations without conditions. On the other side, abroad, China has repeatedly criticized Western sanctions, including those against Russia, but it has also been careful not to provide assistance to Moscow that could lead to sanctions being imposed on Beijing. So, why didn't Ukraine approve the call for surrender in Mariupol before? And how is Russia preparing to cover all the eastern parts for a long period? And could China withdraw from the scene? Numerous questions are directed to our panel of guests. We have Mr. Carole Verrican, a political analyst and contributor to Schiller Institute from France, and Mr. Maximilian Haas, a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute from United Kingdom. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us in this debate. The show begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let me read for you this piece of information. Russian forces are advancing from staging sites in the Donbass toward Kramatorsk, which is still being bombarded by the rockets, according to the British Ministry of Defense. The ministry's most recent assessment said that significant levels of Russian air activity remain in eastern Ukraine as Moscow attempts to retake the region, and Russia may expand strikes on Donbass as it seeks to display success in Ukraine ahead of its Victory Day festivities on May 9th. Mr. Carole, starting with you, would you tell us first how would the current Russia-Ukraine crisis affect the domestic political scene in France and the presidential elections? And can Macron use this crisis to win a second term if he managed to share a diplomatic solution between Russia and Ukraine?
I can't hear you.
I would love to repeat my question to Mr. Carole. He didn't hear us. Would you tell us, Mr. Carole, first, how would the current Russia-Ukraine crisis affect the domestic political scene in France and the presidential election? And can Macron use this crisis to win a second term if he managed to share a diplomatic solution between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it is not clear who will profit from this. The way Macron has been dealing and talking to Putin has been considered by the French as something very positive, because they realize that Russia cannot be displaced. At one point, we have to make peace with Russia. We have to find an agreement and work out a deal. Now, Macron has been talking very regularly to Mr. Putin, but in the same time, he has not stood up against the Anglo-American interference and the will to prolong the war. So people are really, and this came also up in the debate yesterday night between Marine Le Pen and Macron, because the issue is that Macron somehow being in the same time in the EU, in the same time in NATO, is not any longer considered by the Russians as a real valuable intermediary person, because he has too many hats and he's not really defending the sovereign interest of France. So he cannot really mediate in this conflict in an appropriate way. But it is always good to keep open a talking channel between Paris and Moscow.
Quite understood. Mr. Maximilian, how can you explain this unexpected move toward the eastern part of Ukraine? Has Russia failed, or this was planned from the very beginning to take control over the Donbass region?
I think the Donbas region was always Russia's primary war aim. We saw a far larger and far more extensive set of war aims in the early days of the conflict in late February than many analysts, myself included, had predicted. The Russian military encountered surprisingly difficult conditions and surprisingly fierce resistance from what they had expected around Kiev, Chernihiv, Sumy in the north, and decided to withdraw to focus on this effort in eastern Ukraine. Their initial goal is the entire territory of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, which they claim as separate states, but extends probably all the way to the entire eastern flank of the Dnieper River that runs through the country.
Mm-hmm. All right. Moving on in our discussion, let me highlight this piece of news. The Russian military announced the first successful test firing of the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile, a next-generation ultra-long-range weapon. During an announcement broadcast on television, President Vladimir Putin said that this missile will make those who try to threaten our country with wild and aggressive bombast should think twice.
I congratulate you on the successful launch of the Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. This is an important and significant event in the development of promising weapon systems for the Russian military. It is truly a unique weapon that will boost the military potential of our armed forces, keep Russia safe from external threats, and make those who try to threaten our country with wild and aggressive rhetoric think twice.
Mr. Karol, coming back to you, it is said that action speaks louder than words. Putin couldn't stop Ukraine and NATO expansion to the eastern part of Europe with negotiations until he launched this military operation. And now he couldn't stop the aid given to Ukraine, from weapons to his threatening to launch new missiles. Do you think that this is only a threat, or he is able to pull the trigger?
Well, Russia remains the most powerful nuclear superpower in the world. Now, the testing of the Satan II Sarmat missile, it was planned long time before. The Pentagon said it was routine testing, that there's between the military, the U.S. military, where they got advance warning that this test would take place. So from the military standpoint, things are under control. From the political standpoint, it has a double message. First of all, Putin, for his inside Russia, after the sinking of the Moskva, which was probably shut down with intelligence given by the Americans or the British to the Ukrainians, and by using drones in the Black Sea to confuse the radar systems of this ship. Obviously, Putin has to show that Russia has a real strong defense and that it is ready to confront any adversary. For the political side, it's obviously sending a message to the Europeans, which are including especially Britain, because the British have announced that they eventually would be ready to go alone to attack, to go and support Ukraine without any vote of NATO, as it was done in the invasion of Iraq, which was the coalition of the willing. It was not a NATO vote. So I think Putin is sending a very clear message to Britain that if they are dreaming about going alone into this war, that there will be a very, very strong response.
Mm-hmm. This is a really strong statement. Mr. Maximilian, do you agree with Mr. Karol saying that this threat is kind of directly to UK, taking into consideration that the Prime Minister weeks ago visited Kiev, and kind of it was also considered as a challenge to Putin?
I think that the statement is certainly aimed at the UK. The UK looms particularly largely in Russian foreign policy decision-making thought, but it is, of course, also aimed at the United States, which has been providing these kind of, which has been providing defense support for Ukraine, and which these ICBMs, their hypersonic status, supposedly is meant to negate U.S. anti-ICBM technologies. Whether it actually does that is, of course, something that we don't want to test and find out, but that is the Russian claim that what it does. So I think it's primarily aimed at the UK and the US. That being said, however, I don't think it is really worth worrying too much about Russia's nuclear threats. These are the actions of a deranged and increasingly unhinged from reality president who is trying to now govern his country like North Korea and use the same kind of signaling tactics that North Korea does with its potential nuclear arsenal and its ICBMs. But personally, my concern about the risk of nuclear warfare does not grow when Putin has tantrums on TV.
Mr. Carroll, it is said that UK in Europe and US outside Europe, they are kind of, they want this war to continue because it serves their interests. Do you agree with that?
Well, it is different. I make a strong difference between their natural interest and their geopolitical interest. We're talking about the Thucydides trap, which means that Russia and China are the rising powers, and the US and the Anglo-American system, especially since the 2008 financial crash and the global decline of economic production in terms of industry, science, education, technology, they are a declining empire. So the Thucydides trap is that the ruling empire will try to knock down the people which are arriving and coming in. So the real issue is that we're seeing we need a new international security architecture to handle this shift, which means that we're not living in 1945, we're living in 2022, and China, India, Turkey, Indonesia, the BRICS, the many other countries are on the rise and we have to rethink the international institutions, including the IMF, the World Bank, the United Nations. All this should be rethought in function of a new paradigm of not competition and rivalry, but in terms of mutual understanding and mutual development, in which creating a framework in which regional and local issues can be solved without military conflict. And the issue is not Ukraine. The issue is that Russia is demanding to renegotiate the three treaties of arms control, the not expansion of NATO, the not stationing of nuclear weapons on its borders. This is the issue. It's not Ukraine as such. And the war, instead of answering these legitimate demands, the West has been using Ukraine as a hand grenade to bleed Russia into a mortal war, and they don't really give very much about Ukraine, which is like any hand grenade thrown to be exploded and destroyed in this war.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Maximilian, Mr. Carroll is saying that Ukraine has been sacrificed. I mean, Ukraine was using as a proxy. And at the same time, and based also on what he has said, and based on the studies that is linked to your studies, the Soviet Union file. So what is happening now, can we link it to the Cold War? And how can you consider Putin's statements? Enemies should think twice.
Well, I'll respond to that in three parts. First, I think Putin's worldview and his rhetoric are not actually reflective of the world order as they are. Putin comes from a neo-Soviet line of thinking in which he sees the world as in this existential clash, perhaps more driven by civilizational logic and the ideas that we know from Samuel Huntington than by necessarily the ideological conflict of left-right and communism. But he still sees Russia as revanchist and trying to reestablish itself as a world power. That brings me on to my second point, which was the mention of the IMF and the sort of what Westerners often call the rules-based international order, which extends not only to the defense paradigm, but also to finances and the way the global political economy is structured in a way that is particularly dependent on the dollar. I agree that there are many, many issues with this system and that it is important to have an open and frank discussion about it. That being said, this system is what enabled not only Russia to join the ranks of the global middle class through the 1990s, but is also what, for example, helped rebuild France after World War II and enabled sustained and continued French development, much as the left and the right in that country don't see it that way. Now, this is because what makes dollar systems work, just the same as made the Pax Britannica work before it, or that made even Venice's currency be a suitable base for the global economy for a number of years in the 16th century, is that it is accompanied by a Pax Americana, a Pax Britannica, or a Pax Venetia. I would say, this is, of course, the U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq are tragedies and huge foreign policy mistakes that undermine this, but they didn't fundamentally impact that system. Russia's threats here shouldn't be allowed to fundamentally impact that system either, and it should certainly not get a seat at the table with those discussions, considering how wanton and aggressive it is. Finally, on my last point, I'll say that the idea that the West has used Ukraine as sort of a way to damage Russia and hurt it is frankly ridiculous. I was in Ukraine in 2014 during the revolution. That was driven by local Ukrainians whose only comment to me was, why are you the only American here? And why are we not getting support? Russia has steadily bled Ukraine for 8 years, including in the Donbass, and seized its territory illegally because Putin knows that a successful democracy in Ukraine, which it does not have yet, it has to be said, is a threat to him.
Perfectly understood. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Thursday proposed a global security initiative to promote security for everyone in the world. Mr. Xi Jinping also reaffirmed China's opposition to one-sided sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction.
And extreme egoism are fundamentally unworkable, and in any decoupling, cutting off supplies, and extreme pressure are fundamentally unworkable. Confrontation is unworkable. We should adhere the peaceful settlement of differences and disputes between countries through dialogue and consultation. Support all efforts that are conducive to peaceful resolution of crises, do not practice double standards, and oppose the abuse of unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction.
Mr. Caro, coming back to you, China has refused to condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which Moscow calls a special operation. China also blamed the Ukraine crisis on NATO's eastward expansion. So, based on this information, do you think China would change its status toward backing up Russia if its interest is being compromised by these sanctions?
Well, China is attached of not entering back into the logic of the blocks and of the separation of the world in two blocks, because this is absurd. And many other countries, including India is not applying the sanctions. Indonesia decided yesterday they will invite Putin in Bali in mid-November to assist at the G20, saying very simple, why did we create the G20 is because whatever people are, they should come together, and these are the type of institutions which should be used to create mutual development and create the conditions to get us out of this confrontationist outlook. So I think it is this whole idea that Russia is isolated today, it's kind of a misunderstanding, because if you take the world map, you have the EU, you have the Five Eyes and some 7 countries, and that's it, And the people who are applying the sanctions, it's a huge part of South America and Latin America and Africa, which are not going along, because there is also physical reality, is that if you add up China, Russia, and Kazakhstan, you have like 40. And you take the raw materials and the metals and the food and the wheat production, and you come up to 30-40% of all the crucial materials we need as for the development of humanity as a whole, which is produced and under control of these countries. So we cannot make them a pariah and destroy these economies. That means destroying ourselves. If Germany and France, especially Germany, but also Greece and other countries, if we don't have the gas and the resources, we will just go back 50 or 100 years back in history.
Quite important. We'll come to the point of energy. Mr. Maximilian, last month, the head of the UK cyber intelligence, Sir Jeremy Fleming, has warned that China's long-term interests are not served by the alliance with Moscow. Yet, China didn't condemn to Russia and is still opposing the West by strengthening its relations with Russia. So, do you think this is a sort of challenge from Beijing, or this is the reality? In other words, no one dares to sanction China.
There are sanctions on China, both from the Europeans and the United States over its genocide against the Muslim population of East Turkestan, Xinjiang. So people certainly are willing to sanction China. I don't think they're willing to sanction the core and fundamental trade at this point. That is true. I will say, and also in response to the previous points, Russia may not be completely isolated, but for what matters, it's isolated. Russia can't grow without debt and financing. And Indonesia and India certainly can't provide that. India also doesn't provide the kind of exports that it needs to replace as a result of these sanctions. The one country that really could bail out Russia and could do so very quickly and at relatively low cost to itself is China. And China is not willing to do that. We've seen Chinese government financial institutions halt new loans in Russia. Perhaps the most significant is the Chinese have frozen their participation on a very large petrochemical gas plant in Siberia, just on the border between them, that was supposed to be the largest new one in Russia in many years. And China isn't offering Russia the kind of financial assistance that it needs to stop its economy from cratering as a result of these sanctions. So I actually think China certainly sees an intent to reorder the world over the long term, but it sees Russia and it sees Vladimir Putin in particular right now and his wanton actions as more of a threat to its attempts to recast the global order than it does as an opportunity to weaken them. The dollar system in the West tend to get stronger in times of international crisis, an idea called anti-fragility, and China sees Putin accidentally uniting the West in a way that it hasn't been in many years.
Quite understood. Now coming to the part of the energy. The head of Italian diplomacy, Luigi Di Maio, and the Italian Minister of Energy Transition, Roberto, signed two memorandums of understanding with Angola to notably increase gas supplies. Italy wishes to reduce its dependence on Russian energy in the context of Russia-Ukraine crisis.
The signing of an important agreement between our countries by our Minister of Oil and Gas and also by the Italian Minister. But this is the only one of the steps that we have taken because we have a diversified cooperation with Italy. I think we have enough elements for a strong cooperation and above all a strategic partnership.
And finally, I want to thank the ministers, all the Angolan authorities and especially the President for the collaboration that exists between us, for the work that awaits us next month and in the years to come. Thank you very much.
Mr. Karl, do you think that Italy in Europe and in general can replace the Russian gas rapidly as they make it seems? Because weeks ago, high-ranking Italian officials were in Algeria for this purpose, finding a replacement for Russia's energy products. And now they went to Angola. Do you think that they can replace the Russian gas very rapidly?
Very rapidly, it's a very challenging technical issue because the gas from Russia arrives through gazoduc pipelines. If you bring in gas from Angola, you bring it in as liquid natural gas, which means you have to convert. Once it arrives, you need the equipment to receive it, and then you have to reconvert it. Makes it much more expensive. And many European countries, they don't have the terminals, which would be like would take at least 2 years to really convert Europe to have you have to increase by 6 the number of terminals to convert liquid natural gas into usable gas for the consumption. So it cannot be done overnight. It can be done in the next 3 years. But in the same time, well, what do you do with your industries? Do you shut down? Individual consumption is one thing, industrial production is another one. In France, for example, we have many aluminium and zinc production that the price is now so high that the industries have been shut down. They're just waiting till the price goes down again. So this thing is completely out in the open, and it cannot really be predicted how it will work out.
Mr. Maximilian, how do you see this tour by Western nations such as Italy and US lately visiting Gulf countries, trying to convince them to step up their energy production? Don't you think that alternatives are rather costly?
Alternatives in terms of alternative energy sources are, of course, rather costly right now, but their costs have come down rapidly. The costs of solar power have come down in, frankly, ways that are far faster than energy prices ever came down from more traditional hydrocarbon-based resources in the past. So I certainly think it's imperative that the West continue to further invest in green energy sources and alternative energy sources. It's also very important that the West seek both traditional and new allies that are able to replace some of the Russian gas. I think it is beyond time that Germany and France in particular get behind calls to ban Russian oil and gas imports, at least while the war is still ongoing. That being said, I do think there's one issue that Europe hasn't debated enough, and that shows some of the issues with the European Union, which is that there is a very, very large gas source within Europe available, and that already has all the infrastructure built, even if it's never produced at the levels before, and that is the natural gas field in Groningen in the Netherlands, which the Dutch government is taking offline because it has caused a number of issues for local residents, including some minor earthquakes that have caused fears of potential damage to homes. I think the European Union's first and foremost priority, even over trying to get more gas supplies from LNG partners like Qatar, Australia, the United States, or pipeline suppliers like Algeria, should be restarting Groningen and draining it as fast as possible to replace that Russian gas. This cost should be socialized across the European population, potentially some kind of insurance mechanism, tax to repay those residents of Groningen whose homes could be at risk or lose value as a result of this renewed activity. But I think this is one of the foremost priorities that sadly is not getting any attention.
Understood. 1 minute left for us to end up this show. Mr. Carroll, in a couple of words, can you say that a new world order is emerging on the by sacrificing Ukraine?
Yes, I think it's also a new order where the dollar will be declining as the reserve currency. The fact that the Treasury of the US has confiscated the deposits of the Afghan central bank and now of the Russian central banks makes the US and London a very bad place to put your money. So I think money knows where to go. And the new world is, it's not here in Europe. The new world is in Asia. And we better should wake up and be part of it.
Thank you so much, Mr. House. 1 word or a couple words, 20 seconds left.
The best place to put your money still remains the United States and Europe. There are very strong capital controls in Asia, so you can't get your money in and out. I agree it was a huge mistake to seize the Afghan central bank's government. It's money, but giving money to the Taliban is bad. Giving money to the Russians is probably even worse right now, and these are the right things to do.
Mr. Carroll, Mr. Maximilian, thank you so much for this intervention. I really do appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. A special coverage will be held also tomorrow. For now, have a blessed evening.